Welcome to this short video series which will introduce you to APIs. My name is Valentin Despa, and in this video you will learn about the HTTP protocol and try to understand its role when working with APIs. If you have missed any of the previous videos on what is an API and how to use an API, make sure you check the video description. Now let's get started with this video. Most web APIs use HTTP as a communication protocol, and it is essential that you know how to build HTTP requests and understand the HTTP responses you get back from the API. Without learning some basics about the HTTP protocol, understanding the documentation of an API can be quite difficult. Before we get deeper into HTTP, let's cover some of the terminologies you may encounter. REST or RESTful is an API architecture used for working with resources, and right now it is the most widespread API style. Before REST, a popular way to share data was SOAP, which used the XML format to represent the data. So XML is another way to represent data like JSON is, but has become less popular over time. One of the reasons compared to JSON is that even if you want to send a bit of data like a number, the message is still relatively large. Especially for mobile apps, this overhead can lead to a bad user experience as the data takes longer to load. Looking forward, in recent years, GraphQL has grown a lot in popularity, but as most of the APIs rely on the REST architecture, we won't go into SOAP and GraphQL at this time. So let's go back to REST. The term that you will hear a lot is resource. A resource is an API term that describes a piece of data such as a customer or an order or any kind of data you would typically store in a database. Let's take a look at the GitHub API for a second, and you will find a link in the video description. If you don't know, GitHub is a popular Git hosting service for both private and public projects. When you're trying to work with an API, you want to know what kind of data is available and how you can access it. This is why the API documentation is important. In this case, the resources are the types of data you can get from the API. So for example, here if I go to the reference, I'll see here in the middle different kinds of resources that are available in the GitHub REST API. So we can get repositories, information about teams, users, and so on. There are many resources that you can get. And here comes another API-related term, endpoint. An endpoint is a fancy name for the address where you find a resource. I must admit that all these terms in the HTTP protocol can be confusing, especially if you just want to see some action and get started with APIs. So why is it important to understand the HTTP protocol? The first step you need to do when you want to use any API is to try and get it to work by fetching some data. And you need to know which endpoints to call and how to build your request. So let's go back to the GitHub API. Say you want to use the GitHub API to get a list of repositories. At first, the documentation can be confusing, partly because you may not be familiar with the way it is described. So it is normal to feel overwhelmed. This is why knowing some HTTP basics is essential. As you remember from the previous videos, in the communication between a client and a server, HTTP messages are exchanged. For example, your browser or Postman are considered clients. The client will send an HTTP request, and the server will send an HTTP response back. Without getting too technical, an HTTP request has the following parts. The HTTP method or the HTTP verb, most commonly get, post, put, or delete. The URL or the address, headers, and optionally a body. The HTTP verb is a semantical way used in REST APIs to indicate what you're trying to do. Get is for getting a resource. Post is for creating a new resource. Put is for updating an existing resource. And delete is for deleting a resource. While these HTTP verbs are very common, the list does not end here. Let me give you an example so that you can better understand this. Say you want to order some groceries online. With post, you can create an order and add all items you had in the shopping cart. With get, you can inspect, you can view the order that you have submitted. Let's say you have forgotten to add a frozen pizza. With a put request, you can make changes to the order, for example, by adding items, by changing the quantity, or by removing items altogether. A few minutes later, you open the fridge and realize that your partner has already brought all the items, so you decide to cancel the order by using the delete verb. Using the HTTP verbs, as I have previously exemplified, is just a commonly accepted best practice that only applies to REST APIs. Now, this is the part that confuses many beginners, and it is really important that you understand it. You don't get to decide which HTTP verb to use or how to format your request body. The API provider will tell you in the API documentation how to do this. For example, you may not be able to change your order once you have submitted it. Just because the HTTP protocol has all these verbs, it does not mean that the API provider needs to accept them. Let's move on to the address where the HTTP message is going. The address contains the base URL, which is the main address where the API exists, and it does not change when using the API. So to have a valid URL that you can use in Postman, you need to combine the protocol, which is HTTP or HTTPS, followed by column // the base URL, and the endpoint. In the first example, I will have the base URL, example.com/API/orders. That's going to be the endpoint. And as long as you use the same API, the base URL will not change. What changes is the endpoint, depending on the data you want to get or send. So the endpoint can be the orders, can be customers, or can be anything else that the API documentation specifies. As far as we are concerned, when using APIs, there's no difference between HTTP and HTTPS. HTTPS is a secure version of the HTTP protocol. It ensures that all the data we send and retrieve is encrypted. For this reason, you should always use HTTPS whenever the API supports this. Now, it is time to get some hands-on experience in Postman. Let's go back to the Postman Jobs API, copy the example URL, and bring it in Postman. So the address is composed of the protocol. You'll see here it is HTTPS, the base URL, which is this one, and then we have the endpoint, which is /jobs, and after that we have the query parameters. And we'll have here two query parameters, which are also displayed in Postman, Q, which allows us to query for something, and location. Don't confuse path parameters with query parameters. Path parameter is the job ID, so we can take this address, we can specify here job ID and add this value. This will be a path parameter because it is part of the path. It will be replaced here. But I'm going to add here a dummy query parameter. And of course, the API will completely disregard this. And you will see here the path parameter is before the query parameter. So it's important that you don't confuse path parameters with query parameters. Path parameters are part of the endpoint as they appear before the question mark, if there's any question mark there, and are surrounded by forward slashes. So at least here, they will see a forward slash before it. A query parameter will never have a forward slash. It will always start with a question mark, and then you will see the query parameters. In this case, our HTTP request does not have a request body. Since we're just requesting data, we're not sending any information. So now let's submit this request and take a look at the lower part of the screen where we have the HTTP response. First of all, the HTTP response will always include the status code. And typically the status codes that you will get is 200 OK, 404 will indicate that the resource could not be found, or for example 401 will indicate that you're not authorized to get the specific information. So we can easily change something about our request, for example by specifying here an invalid parameter, job ID, and then we'll get 404 not found as a status because we don't have any jobs with the ID test. What makes most of the response is the response body itself. In this case, the response body contains, formatted as JSON, the information about this job. And we also have some headers in the response. Typically, headers contain some meta information, so data about data that we have received. They're often very technical. For example, like the barcodes you see on every package you receive when you order something online. It's kind of similar in concept to that. So they ensure that the communication works properly, but especially in the beginning, you don't have to worry so much about headers. There's still a header that I wanted to point out, and this is the content type. And you'll see here it says application/JSON. So application/JSON simply means that the API is telling Postman, the client, hey, what I'm sending you here in the body, this is JSON. And Postman uses this information to give you this nice view here. So instead of showing you this, which is not so easy to read, Postman will understand, oh, I'm getting back JSON, that's great. And you'll see here JSON is automatically selected in this list. So knowing that you get back JSON, it will format this as JSON and it will look much nicer. The Postman Jobs API does not allow us to post a new job, but let's open up a new tab and try a post request where we send some data. I'm going to exemplify this by using a service called postman-echo.com. And this is a service that will reflect back everything that we send. Now, postman-echo.com is the base URL for this API, and we're going to use an endpoint which is called post. So /post is what I'm going to select here. And instead of get from this list, I'm going to go ahead and select post. This API is useful for understanding how to build requests, but apart from sending back the data we have already sent, it is useless as no data is persisted on the server. So we can say it's a very atypical API, but it's very useful for learning as we can try out different values and we'll see in the response if the API has understood them. Now let's imagine that we want to submit an order for groceries. So with this post request here, we can send a request body. So in order to send a request body, I'm going to go here to body. And I'm going to assume that this API accepts JSON. So from the options available here, I'm going to select raw. And from the list that appeared here, instead of text, I will select JSON. And now here we can start writing JSON. So what we're sending here is essentially an object. So I'm going to start with a curly bracket. And Postman will automatically add 1 at the end. And between double quotes, I'm going to specify keys and values. So for example, a key would be something like my name. So let's say this will be John Doe. This is the name of the person ordering the product. And you'll see here that JSON allows you to send a key and a value, and both are between quotes because both of them are strings and they are separated by a column in the middle. Now I'm going to add additional information like about the products that I want to add, and I'm going to add here a comma after the first line, and this will allow me to add a new line. Let's say I want to order some products. And I'm going to put here between brackets a list of products that I want to order. So let's say I want to order milk, eggs, butter, and that should be enough. And again on a new line, I'm going to write here my delivery address, which again can be an object which has multiple properties, like for example street, city, state, and so on. So I'm totally making up these values, but I just wanted to show you how you can create a post request. So I'm going to go ahead, click on send. And what you should get back here is in the data, exactly what you have sent should be reflected here as well. So you'll see here I have data, name, John Doe, the products that I have ordered, the delivery address. And the rest of it is not really important at this point, but what you should see here is the data that you have sent here. So if your data doesn't look like mine, like nicely structured, this indicates that the server was unable to parse your JSON successfully. Now, writing valid JSON is part of the agreement between you and the API. If you are providing invalid JSON, then the server is not responsible for fixing your JSON or trying to make out what you wanted to say. It can only be valid or invalid. And there are many ways as a beginner how you can make your JSON invalid. For example, you can forget to put values between quotes, okay? And when you do that, Postman will try to help you out. So it will mark here on the right-hand side, you will see this is red, and this here will be marked as well as a problem. So if I'm sending this, you will see here the data appears here, but it's not formatted in a way that it's easy to understand. So obviously this couldn't be parsed as JSON. Another reason for this could be the fact that you have forgotten a comma somewhere. So for example, if after a line you have something below it and you don't add this, again, this will show up in red and it will be invalid JSON here. This example given is just a dummy post request. Whenever you make a real post request, the API provider will tell you in the API documentation how to do this, like what is the expected structure of the JSON body, which endpoints you should use, and so on. But I just wanted to practice a bit to see how this is working. I also wanted to go back to the request and point out the request headers. By default, Postman will send some headers and you will not see them unless you click here on this hidden. And you will see here the headers that have been added. I wanted to point out the content type header, which you already know from the response. And as soon as we went inside the body and we selected JSON, so what we did here, we created a body, a raw body, and we have selected JSON. Postman has automatically added this header for us, telling the API, oh, by the way, what we're sending here is JSON. So Postman adds these headers to your request to ensure a smooth communication with the server and, of course, to reduce the amount of work you need to do. One particular use case for headers is also to provide authentication information. Not all APIs or endpoints are public. For example, the job API doesn't have a public endpoint where we can add jobs. And of course, this is an internal thing. You don't want anyone to be able to add new data, but you may want everyone to be able to read that data. Postman offers various authentication helpers. So I'm just going to demonstrate how these authentication helpers work. I'm going to go here to authorization. And let's select from the list bearer token. And then enter the value mySecretToken. If we go back to the headers, you'll see that we have now one additional header. And this authorization header has been added by Postman. You will see here it has the value bearer space and the value that we have entered, mySecretToken. I know that this may not be very exciting, but it is an important part of learning how to deal with APIs. So now we can go ahead and click on send. And we should also be able to see this header here reflected back by this API under the authorization. And you will see here mySecretToken. Finally, I just want to demystify the HTTP messages. So in Postman, we have here the Postman console, which is a great debugging tool, and it will show you exactly what happens with the request that you're sending. So I'm going to click here on console, and here you will see a list of all the requests that you have submitted. I'm going to go here on clear, and I'm going to submit this request once again. And you will see that as soon as I do this, this request will be logged here in the console. Let's open this up and to see what exactly a request contains. And you will see here we have the request headers, These are already collapsed. We have a request body, and we also have response headers and response body. We also have the possibility of showing here a raw log. So this is essentially how an HTTP message looks like. What you see here is a post request to the post endpoint, and this is what is technically called the start line. The HTTP verb and the endpoint, but not the full address you see in Postman. This has been added as a header using the host value. However, since you never directly generate such messages, I've also simplified my explanation to be more beginner-friendly and to match what you see and control in Postman. Now, essentially, this is the HTTP request itself. There's nothing special about it. This is just a text. You can right-click on it and copy it in a text editor. But this has been generated by Postman, and you don't have to do this manually because Postman does it for you. So there's nothing fancy about the message itself. It is just text, but the way it is formatted matters. The same goes for the response, which you will see here down below. HTTP is not the only protocol that APIs can use. Recently, Postman has added support for WebSockets and gRPC and may add more protocols in the future, as we find ourselves in a very dynamic industry. But at this point, HTTP remains the most popular protocol for working with APIs. So just to recap, the request contains the URL, an HTTP method or HTTP verb like get, post, put, and delete, a list of headers, and optionally a body, which typically contains the data that you're sending to the API. And also the response, which has a status code 200, 404, 401, a list of headers, and most of the time a body. I hope that this video series gave you a better understanding of what an API is and how you can use one. Click at the end of this screen to continue with another video series that goes a bit deeper into how you can use Postman to interact with APIs. All the URLs and additional resources are available in the video description. I hope to see you again in another series, and until then, thank you very much for watching.